Hello, and welcome to today's installment of StratCom Talks. My name is Christina Van Sant, and I am a research associate at the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence here in Riga, Latvia. I will be moderating today's discussion. As a center, we strive to be at the forefront of strategic communications. In these StratCom Talk sessions, we will explore aspects of strategic communications through different perspectives, engaging with the private sector, public sector, and academia. We invite our viewers to participate by asking us questions, leaving their thoughts in the comment sections on our Facebook and YouTube feeds. In our previous 3 editions of StratCom Talks, we were joined by some excellent speakers to discuss topics such as influencer marketing, challenges in communications during the COVID-19 crisis, and most recently, how governments and organizations can improve their crisis response capability. All episodes of StratCom Talks can be viewed on our Facebook page or YouTube channel. So today, I am joined by experts Tor Bjørstad and Yiling Teo to discuss data brokers, risks, and vulnerabilities. This topic is particularly relevant to the COE, where we have been looking into how data brokers create security issues for military organizations. We will actually be publishing a report on this topic in the coming weeks. Before we properly introduce our speakers and really dive into this topic, we need to answer the question, what are data brokers? And to help us do so, our AI expert will give us an introduction in this short video.
Basically, a data broker is a company which collects, aggregates, and trades data. So, for example, if you use your mobile phone to post something in social media, or you use some other third-party services, or you buy something using your credit card, then you leave a small piece of data about yourself, which includes your personal data, and it includes also behavior, how you behave on the internet, for example. And this data is being collected by the data brokers, which afterwards creates a user profiles. And these user profiles are basically important digital entities that are being sold to other companies which are using for advertisements or direct marketing. The data collected by the data brokers could be used in various ways. Direct marketing or targeted activities, targeted advertisement could be used either by individuals, and it could be used also for a group, because if the data brokers collect enough data and they do the consumer profiling, then it's easier for marketing agencies to target directly the group of interest. So in general, we could say that the data brokers, they allow or enable the marketing companies to to segment the market, basically to segment the consumers, and allow them more efficiently to target the group of interest. There are various aspects why we should worry about the data we are sharing, because the data brokers, they are collecting billions of data points. And to be honest, not all data broker companies are really transparent of what they do, the activities what they are doing, the operations what they do. There is a lack of understanding and lack of motivation for consumers to engage in understanding of user agreements, for example, to understand what they consent to when they are using so-called free services. If you give away enough data about yourself, about your behavior, about what you like, who you are, basically, what are your hobbies, and so on, you could become a victim of unwanted targeted advertisement. This would be one way, and you can become a victim of political manipulation. Basically, there is this saying, there is no free lunch. So if you are using something for free, then you become a product of someone, for someone. And your data that you produce or your behavior becomes a product. Always you have to read what data is being collected by user agreements. It's completely clear that the data-based services can deliver high-end and intelligent services for end user, and everyone is expecting to have high-quality services, and we have to pay for those services by giving up our data. We need to ensure that the data we are sharing is managed and traded in a secure way. Therefore, the legislation which regulates the data broker industry should be updated and improved. The data collected by the data brokers could threaten your personal integrity. It would put under the question your rights to your privacy. And in military contexts, you could imagine that someone could use the GPS coordinates, like shared GPS coordinates, to track or to identify military bases. There was experiments carried out by New York Times journalists who showed that basically from one data set they were able to identify Secret Service agents who were working for a president's security detail. In the conclusion, I would suggest to always pay attention what kind of data we're sharing, or even to just do a small research what kind of data is being collected by services we are using. This would help for the individuals to understand whether they put themselves under the risk or not.
Thanks to Gundars, our AI expert. So now that we have established a baseline as to what data brokers are and the possible threats that they pose, I will introduce our first speaker, Tor Bjørstad. Tor is an experienced cybersecurity professional who has worked as a security researcher and consultant since 2005. He holds a PhD in cryptography from the University of Bergen in Norway. Tor's work touches on cybersecurity and privacy issues in critical areas such as election systems, public services, financial infrastructure, and energy. Tor leads the application security practice in the Norwegian cybersecurity company Mnemonic. Mnemonic helps businesses manage their security risks, protect their data, and defend against cyber threats. Tor, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Riga via video call. How are things in Norway?
Hi. So thanks for the kind introduction. Things are going well in Norway. The weather is nice and pretty good.
Very good. So before I really yield the floor over to you, I was wondering if you had anything to add to the video of Gundars that we just watched. Otherwise, feel free to just dive into your presentation.
Thank you. I don't think I have anything directly to add, but I will maybe shed some additional details on this topic in my presentation.
Okay.
So is the presentation streaming now?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to talk for a short while about data brokers, risks, and vulnerabilities. And I will do so based on a study that we did together with the Norwegian Consumer Council, which is a consumer interest organization in Norway. And we did this project last fall and published it in January. It's called Out of Control. And what we looked at in the study is basically 10 well-known Android apps and their data sharing practices. So each of the apps that we looked at had between 5 million and 100 million downloads in the Google Play Store. And so we believe that these apps are fairly representative of the mobile advertising ecosystem at the time of the study. So this is basically the very beginning of the data economy, where individual data is being collected, harvested, and aggregated. And our approach to this study was pretty naive. We set up each of these 10 apps in our lab and tried to observe and understand their behavior and the data that they were sharing and who they were sharing it with. One thing that we learned very quickly in this project is how invasive mobile advertising and data collection can be. And there are a few different reasons for that. One is that your mobile device is a very personal item, and the apps that you use and the data that you process on your phone or your tablet can be a very big part of your private life. Another thing that we saw was that mobile sensor data provides a lot more information about you than a general web browser. So we will get into some of the details of that as we go along. But I'd like to highlight in particular the GPS location data, or GPS location time series, which is the position, the time, together with some kind of persistent identifier, which we saw that could be very problematic because there is a lot of information that can be inferred about somebody based on their movements. And it's very, very difficult to anonymize this kind of data. So I guess a key question is that location-aware services are great for users, but who gets access to all this data that's generated, and how is it being used on the back end? So it's worth exemplifying what kinds of data we're talking about when it comes to mobile data collection, and I will give a few examples. One thing that we looked at quite a bit was unique identifiers that enables data brokers and advertisers to identify usage across different apps. A specific example is the Android advertising ID, which is basically built into Android for this purpose. And even though it's possible for users to reset the Android advertising ID, it can't really be turned off completely. Another thing we looked at was wireless and sensor data from the phone, and we saw that companies were collecting everything from Bluetooth signals, Wi-Fi signals, other sensor data such as gyroscope information. A third category is, as I mentioned earlier, data collected to the user's physical location, particularly GPS, but also information about local cell towers or IP addresses and similar. Then there's information about the specific mobile devices, such as configuration and installed apps. And finally, there's application data and information about the individual user, such as age and gender. So this figure shows some of the different categories of companies and the companies that are involved in the data and advertising economy. This is far from a complete list. We all know about Google and Facebook, but how many of us know all these other companies? And how do we get insight into what data they're collecting and what they're doing with it? This is a billion-dollar industry that consists of a vast undergrowth of companies, and the rate of change is high, and it's difficult to get bearings. To give a more concrete example, we looked at the dating app Grindr in our study. In their own words, Grindr is the world's #1 free mobile social networking app for gay, bi, trans, and queer people to connect. And we saw that a lot of information about the app usage was actually being sent directly to advertisers. So there's just information that a particular device is using Grindr says something about the user. And we have things like the app name and keywords signifying the topic. We had the persistent users identifier, the Android advertising ID, that was being shared quite widely. We saw in a lot of cases that GPS coordinates were being shared, and Grindr is a location-based app, so it needs to have permission to access the GPS. But it was also sharing that data quite widely. We did see in some cases that user data was being shared. In this case, the gender of the user was sent as a parameter. And finally, the timestamp for this event is implicit because this is part of real-time advertising request. So this is an example of all the information that's being baked into a single advertising request from the app to a third party. And this is just the observable first-order collection. And we know that in many cases, user data will be collected, processed, resolved, and disseminated. And as users, we have very little control over and very little insight into how this is being done. And I think already at this point, we see the potential for abuse, such as discrimination based on attributes such as age, race, or gender, or the potential for micro-targeting of political messages, spreading disinformation and fake news. I'm also going to say a few more words about data brokers and some recent work that was done independently of our study. In May this year, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation published an article series on location data brokers. In the NRK study, they had purchased data on the open market for approximately 30,000 Norwegian kroner. That's, I guess, about 3,000 euros. And the data they received covered the location of more than 100,000 Norwegian users throughout much of 2019. This is also very similar to the study that was done by the New York Times in 2019. The dataset that NRK got did not contain any directly identifiable information, such as phone numbers or names. Regardless of this, it was immediately possible for them to identify individuals in the dataset and infer interesting facts about their private lives. I got permission from the NRK team to share 2 illustrations from this work. This photo shows an overview of the Rena military base in Norway. In their dataset, NRK found 40 mobile devices and more than 5,000 check-ins, and they were able to track movement within the base area, including specific areas within that perimeter. By following the individual devices' movement outside the base, it was in many cases possible to identify the owners as well. Another example is this heat map, which shows activity at sensitive locations across Norway. NRK was also able to single out the movements of an individual over a 10-month period, revealing his identity. This person was tracked between several interesting locations, including army bases, radar stations, and more. To round off this short introduction, I will say that from our experience as cybersecurity professionals, it's pretty certain that user data is going to leak. We've already had some well-publicized breaches, such as the 2015 Office of Personnel Management breach or the 2017 Equifax data breach in the United States. I do think it's an open question when we will see the first major public exposure of this type of data, and in particular, a large-scale public exposure of location data. And it's worth thinking about how such data could be misused for intelligence purposes, for targeted attacks against public figures, or for extortion and cybercrime. Furthermore, I think it's difficult to tell whether this kind of abuse is already happening in private based on closed data sources and closed leaks. To round off, I would like to ask, based on all that we've learned in this research, that if data is really the new oil, then I think we need to start thinking about how to clean up oil spills. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tor, for your presentation. I actually have come up with a couple questions. The first one, specifically referencing the out of control report. You guys found that the amount of data processing and sharing by these apps is illegal under GDPR. And so what sort of measures, if any, are data protection authorities taking to actually enforce GDPR? And what does that form of enforcement even look like?
That's a very good question. As part of our study, the Norwegian Consumer Council worked with the NGO NOIB in order to make several GDPR complaints, and those complaints are currently being investigated by the various data protection authorities. But this is quite a long-running process. Even based on our work, we spent a lot of time to get the data and the evidence we needed in order to make these complaints.
Okay. And then sort of in that same sort of thread, as individual consumers ourselves, how can we protect our personal information from exploitation without having to essentially give up using these apps altogether? And is that even possible?
I think to some extent it's possible to control to some extent what kind of data is being shared by opting out of terms and conditions where that's possible, and by changing settings on your phone to, for example, opt out of targeted advertising, which is possible to do both on Android and iOS. A problem with that is that on Android, actually, the app makers have to respect that opt out, and we saw in our study that was not always done. But to some extent, that helps you limit how data is being spread. But I think part of the problem with this whole industry is that once the data is out there, it can be really difficult to understand who has it and how it's being used. And even what we've seen is that even if data is in a sense anonymized by removing direct identifiers such as phone numbers and names, it can still be possible to reconstruct who you are based on aggregated datasets.
So I actually have a question from one of our viewers, who's actually a colleague from the StratCom COE, Henrik Twetman. He said, really interesting presentation. Thanks, Tor. Do the companies themselves have any control over where the data generated by their apps ends up? Or is that control lost the second the data leave their servers?
That's a very interesting question. And I think it's hard to give a really precise answer to that because there are kind of two different dimensions to it. And one is that typically if you read the privacy policy of a specific app, they might say that they will be sharing this data with a list of their partners. But then if you go to each of these partners, you will see that they may be sharing the information again with other third and fourth parties. And so that means that this quickly gets a bit out of hand. And I think the reason that we call this research out of control was that was exactly what we were seeing. Another aspect of it is that a lot of the advertising takes place by embedding third-party code such as an SDK within a mobile app. And in that setting, the people who are creating the mobile app really has to trust the SDK to behave the way that it says it will behave. And that means that there is a supply chain risk as well if you are getting a tainted SDK into your code, or if there is an SDK that does something else than what's been agreed.
The phrase "out of control" really, I think, captures it quite well. It seems that as soon as you engage with these apps and your personal data, they get a hold of it. This problem itself just sort of compounds and grows out of control. So yeah. I actually have one last quick question for you. In the NRK experiment, sort of drawing back to that, I kind of thought about the question of tracking people or groups of people. How easy is it to carry out sort of group tracking when you are using different data points?
I guess it depends on how you define your group. So NRK has given some very nice presentations about their study, which goes in a lot further in depth into that. But I think one example they gave was that they would take a geographic area of interest, such as the Parliament building here in Oslo, and look at all the devices that are visited within that geographic area within some time frame. And at that point, you can single out specific devices and follow them and correlate with check-ins that have happened outside of that location. So you can, so if you are targeting somebody, you would typically start out by looking at an interesting location and drilling down and then spreading out. And so that location could be anything from a hospital to the Parliament building to whatever.
To a military base.
That's
very interesting. So I do have another question from one of our viewers. Mohammed Faisal wrote, do you think that protecting privacy is a losing game, given that the exchange of data for products and services are unavoidable?
I don't think it's a losing game in the sense that over the last few years, the amount of attention that this has received has been growing quite a bit, and there's several initiatives underway to try to take back some degree of control. I think the problem right now is that so far this is a very unregulated market, and it's a few years ahead of the regulation, so to speak. So I think the important thing right now is that we need to understand what is actually happening and to what extent is that something that should be regulated or should be controlled to better.
Great, great. Thank you so much for your answers. I think at this point we should probably move on to our second speaker's presentation, and in doing so, I feel that the focus of the discussion will be shifted towards a more policy-oriented direction, and so allow me to introduce our second speaker, Ling Teo. Ling is a senior fellow with the Center of Excellence for National Security at the RSIS in Singapore. She researches strategies of national cybersecurity resilience, data protection, and governance regimes, online regulation, and ethics and governance related to artificial intelligence and disruptive technology. Ling has legal practice experience in intellectual property, technology, media, and commercial law. She is the author of Media Law in Singapore, a guide to and discussion of the practical application of media and communication-related laws in Singapore. So welcome, Ling. Thank you for joining us today. I understand that it is the evening for you in Singapore, so it makes it extra special that you are spending your time with us tonight.
Thank you, Christina. You know, these days, and these pandemic days is really no day, no night, in some respects. And but it's been, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I would like to thank the NATO StratCom Center of Excellence for inviting me to speak. And before I jump into my presentation, which is about, it's a follow-up from Thor's presentation, it's about designating the data industry a critical information infrastructure. And I listening to him and his presentation, I do have many points of convergence and agreement with what he has said. I think before I go ahead with my presentation, I'd like to also acknowledge the contribution of my colleague Dimples Leong to the article we wrote together and published in The Diplomat on this topic. So my presentation is going to cover three aspects. Firstly, the lack of regulation or the failure to comprehensively regulate the data broking industry. Secondly, addressing a perceived gap in cybersecurity protection and personal data protection, at least my perception, right? And how designating the data broking industry as a critical information infrastructure might be a solution. And I'll also thirdly look at the regulatory efforts underway around the world to address this issue. So firstly, as to the lack of regulation or the failure to comprehensively regulate the data broking industry. So with data transformation, with digital transformation, data essentially underscores all aspects of our lives. It's a bit trite, but that's the way it is. Data fuels our decision making. It is relied upon by both the public and private sectors as a fundamental resource for societal management and economic functioning. It powers smart cities and in the adoption of Internet of Things. And yet we are struggling, and in some cases have failed to coherently protect it, given the role it occupies. It is the target of cyber criminals, state and non-state sponsored actors, and globally data breaches are a dime a dozen in the public and in the private sectors. The amount of data stored with data brokers opens them to be prime targets of cyber attacks from state and non-state actors. it must stand to reason that the larger the database an entity has or controls, the larger the risk to security is. Now, this applies to both government and private sector entities. Hackers who have breached security systems of data brokers have sold entire databases for profit. An example, in just last year, the database of data broker LimeLeads, containing 49 million business contacts, was put up for sale on an underground hacking forum just over the weekend in Singapore. An online grocery platform, that's part of a larger sort of like a shopping platform, had a data breach of like 1.8 million. The details of 1.8 million users also kind of like stolen and sold on an underground sort of like platform as well. So security experts reveal that with LimeLeads, the issue is that the company stored crucial customer data on an unsecured server, allowing threat actors to gain access. While the server was eventually secured after the horse had bolted, the data of customers containing user details, full name, emails, addresses, were advertised for sale on this underground forum. The data troves obtained from security intrusions, this kind of data could well contribute to identity theft and phone scams. Now, in 2017, the credit brokerage firm Equifax, as Tom mentioned in his presentation, they were hacked, and they failed to ensure stringent cybersecurity practices, and this contributed in part towards the hack. So investigations revealed multiple security vulnerabilities, including unencrypted sensitive personal information and weak safeguards employed in the password administration system. So stolen data from this breach was never recovered. So every time we hear of such a breach, we hear the same, or more or less the same issues again: weak encryption, or no encryption, unsecured, weak passwords, kind of like, like really fragmented or just poor maintenance, and all the usual sort of reasons. And then apart from these data breaches, there's also the threat of foreign interference abuse with the exfiltration of this data. Malware operators could launch spear phishing attacks targeting individuals and companies. And interestingly, the Equifax hack was revealed to be the coordinated effort of Chinese intelligence to steal trade and personal information of American citizens. And then, the famous Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016, Cambridge Analytica claimed it created personal profiles on over 240 million Americans by mining personal data. Now, this data was used to micro-target American voters during the 2016 presidential election. It's funny that we're having this webinar on today of all days, as I think most of us have been in part following and what's going on at the current U.S. presidential elections, and this is the back of a lot of our minds. What is going on in the background? Has there been the same thing? The same approach was used during the 2016 Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, all without knowledge of the public. So data from Cambridge Analytica may have helped to facilitate Russian interference in the US 2016 election. So, and further, in the hands of malicious actors, this data can also become a tool for disinformation campaigns and influence operations. So that's the first part. The second part of my presentation is about addressing a perceived gap in cybersecurity protections and personal data protection, and how designating the data broking industry, CII, could be a solution. So when we speak of cybersecurity, we speak of systems. We speak of how these systems function and what these systems contain, and we speak about how we can secure all these. So there appears, to me at least, to be a gap between cybersecurity protection and personal data protection. And the missing piece, might be, like I said, designating this industry sector critical infrastructure. So critical infrastructure is a term used by governments to describe assets that are essential for the functioning of a society and economy. And these are also described as essential services. Most states recognize CI or CII as, some of the following: energy, communications, water management, land transport, maritime services, provision of government services, media, healthcare, aviation, banking, finance, security, and emergency services. So why not why not the data broking industry and the services it provides? It's not a step too far, as we all understand already how essential data and the information it discloses is for the functioning of society and the economy currently. And it stands to reason that this is not inconceivable. Data is the bedrock of how we want our smart cities to function. If you look at the rest of most of the other CII I've outlined, earlier on, data is needed for all those things to function as well. So your data brokers exist because data can be commodified. There is a huge market across the public and private sectors with an infinite appetite for an infinite permutations of data, or of useful information. Now, these guys are middlemen. Now, how are they allowed to exist? A few thoughts of my top of my head. They thrive on the fact that one, awareness of what they do is low. Two, regulation is fragmented or weak. And three, consent to take data from people is too easily extracted. And this consent, and I use consent, in this manner, carries through all the way in the incredibly opaque supply chain via a series of transactions. Now, Tor mentioned the company A takes it, and company A sells it on to B and C to, further along the chain. And that is the supply chain I speak of. So the data acquisition chain of title, and I'm borrowing this from media production, i.e. proof of provenance and right to exploit, is too easily constructed. So at the individual level, and there was this question raised early on, what can only be done, frankly, from the way I see it, is on a piecemeal basis, and it's incredibly onerous and incredibly demotivating. How often do I have to go through the cookie settings, check, uncheck, and every time, it's you lose track of where you've been and what you've done and which website you've actually done this for. I don't know how much more can be done, frankly, in the current state of affairs. The GDPR goes some way to addressing this, and I noticed that a lot of the websites that come out from Europe, or at least states that have adopted, the best practices of the GDPR, by default, all the marketing cookies are shut off, and it's almost performance cookies or these absolutely essential cookies that are left on. So I see that, and that's some small comfort there. But it may be a question, of individuals, being given more power over how their personal data is collected from them. And I think, more precisely here, the use to which it is put. So on one regulatory level, we see the tightening of the manner and of acquisition of the data from people through privacy or personal data protection legislation. Now, the corresponding level, in order to make the first level meaningful, is to secure the storage, management, and use more formally, and designating this industry as a critical information infrastructure, may well subject this sector to more stringent regulation in terms of securitizing, reporting, auditing, being accountable and being transparent. Now, given the competition to acquire and commodify data, and the burgeoning revenues, which I believe I did a quick kind of like a check when Tor was talking about this part of the industry, I believe it's about 200 USD billion per annum. That's the value. That's the value of the industry. This industry is unlikely to regulate itself, and on this basis, their activities require governmental intervention. Now, at always, advances in technology surrounding data harvesting and exploitation have outstripped the effect of current regulatory mechanisms and also how markets functions. So it's a good as time as any for this to happen. Now, this may be a first step towards ensuring proper safeguards and comprehensively securing personal data for all the purposes it is put to. And when I speak of databases of personal data, I mean, we're not just looking at the private sector. Government database operators, data aggregators, business data users, brokers, all these entities, should be required to bolster cybersecurity measures to protect data and to uphold transparency and accountability for the usage of personal data and their activities. You cannot bifurcate the use of personal data for public sector purposes without a use of data for private sector purposes. I mean, as it is, what we are already seeing is that technological innovations by the private sector that aggregate personal data are being tried, acquired by the public sector, and the company I'm referring to is Clearview AI, and they're currently being investigated. Now, I mean, this is about building trust in our data information ecosystem. The public interest in upholding data protection and safeguarding is a final resource. It's a vital resource. So my third and final point here is about the regulatory efforts underway to globally address this issue. So what's happening? The efforts are sporadic. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation has tightened the limits of data disclosure by data brokers. Non-profit foundation, the Privacy Collective, very recently initiated class action litigation in the Netherlands against data brokers Oracle and Salesforce for breaching GDPR provisions in processing and sharing of citizens' data in the EU. I believe there's a similar lawsuit under the GDPR and the UK's Privacy of Electronic Communication Regulation that will be filed soon in the UK. In the US, discussions are ongoing as to the creation of a national data broker registry. So the proposed Data Broker List Act of 2019 will require data brokers to join the registry, and this is overseen by the Federal Trade Commission. So this bill aims to empower the FTC to maintain a comprehensive information security program to safeguard consumer data from security breaches or data disclosures. In February of this year, the state of Vermont in the US put in place a new law requiring data brokers to register with the Secretary of State. In March 2020, the first enforcement action under this law was brought against Clearview AI for the fraudulent acquisition of brokered personal data by using screen scraping technology. However, law does not go far enough in requiring disclosure of the information on the databases, what data is collected, or who the buyers are. There is also no requirement for brokers to enable consumers to access to their own data or to opt out of data collection. At the federal level, there is currently no designated legislation in the US, but it might potentially change with antitrust concerns of tech companies looming in Congress. There's been bipartisan willingness to enforce data protection standards. A new Senate bill was introduced in February 2020 for the creation of a federal data protection agency to enforce data protection practices in the US. So in Singapore, we have our Personal Data Protection Commission. They've taken enforcement action against unauthorized sale and disclosure of personal data by data brokers for marketing purposes. The PDPC has enforced action against companies who have purchased marketing lists containing consumer data without valid consent. At the beginning, when our Personal Data Protection Act was passed, it established a do not call registry for people to register with to limit specific telemarketing calls and messages, and I believe this is going to be extended to also online advertising and targeting. So that is actually all I have for my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion and questions that follow. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ling. Thank you so much. That was such an insightful presentation. A lot of information there. And I was scribbling down a bunch of different questions. I have to decipher my handwriting. So to start off, we have a comment from Sven Helgeson, who said, "This is a very important discussion to shed a light on data brokers and how our personal data is used as merchandise. Regulators must exist in the first place and have the power and the means to regulate. And we as individuals need to be more vigilant." Do you have anything to add to that? Any sort of comment on that?
The regulators need to do something. I believe regulators are doing something in terms of the examples I gave, but I think regulators need to also understand, as far as they're able to, the extent of what's going on in the industry. And Tor, I read the report that you were involved in by Mnemonic, and all 186 pages of it. And to be completely honest, I knew it was bad, but it was forensically terrifying. Right? If I may use those words to describe it. But this is the kind of work that policymakers and regulators need to pay attention to, because whether we realize it or not, so many aspects of the way we live our lives now, the way we govern, the way we transact, the way we deal with internationally with states, the way we do simple stuff in our lives, like online, especially in this pandemic. A lot of activity has shifted online, and we don't realize how much we are exposing our personal data to. And I don't want to just use the word personal data, but it's elements of ourselves, the things that make up our privacy, the aspects of ourselves which we don't need other people to examine, to take apart, to build lists for targeting, female, age group likes cats, into gardening and home baking, and therefore my Instagram feed is full of stuff which I will say this now, I frequently just report spam, misleading, and things like this. As an individual, what can you do? Get your cyber hygiene in order. And I know that's easier said than done. Be aware of phishing, be aware of malware attacks. When you are transacting online, be aware of, as far as you can, of what you are being asked to give up. Look at, as I said earlier, it is tiring to constantly have to look at your cookies. When you're asked to kind of like, if by using this website, you will be, but you deemed consent to all these cookies being turned on. But at least, I tend to not use websites that don't give me the option to opt out. But it's tiring. It's piecemeal, and at the individual level, sometimes it's just way too onerous. A couple of people who have of my age group who weren't digital natives, obviously not digital natives, but saw the transition. We said just very recently, what, the internet's not fun anymore. It's just so full of booby traps and people who want to take things from you. And maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned, but I kind of like want to harken back to a more analog way of life, once in a while. So I think that's my reaction on that comment.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. I do have another question from Eyvind Andreas Arvesen. It's a bit of a long one, so bear with me. Securing existing data is one thing, but how does classifying data brokers as critical infrastructure solve the issues of the questionable legality and dubious ethics of data collection, processing, and distribution that goes on, at least in part, of this industry? Isn't this really an issue of civil liberties, consumer rights, and human rights?
I'll answer that on two levels. The acquisition of data, that is being mostly dealt with, the regulation of that, how it is collected, and that is dealt with by personal data protection legislation. There's also, if I think about how industries and markets are regulated, instituting a code of practice, as incredible as it may seem to imagine the industry regulating itself, maybe pressure can be brought to bear and get their market practices out in the open so that people understand what's going on. Because right now, and Tor, I think at the end of your presentation, you made that comment about, and we've heard it so many times, and to the point that it's, it's ad nauseum, data is the new oil. But here's the main difference, data, unlike oil, is inexhaustible. It's an inexhaustible resource. And the refinements, and I use this intentionally, intentionally, of how data is going to be used, it's going to change. It'll be different, next year. It'll be different in 5 years' time. People will get better at doing it. So it's time before it's too late. And maybe it is too late, but if we're waking up to the fact that you can regulate this market commercially, maybe some kind of like antitrust kind of like measure, that's a market adjustment. And then the next level, the security issue, that is a cybersecurity issue. That is where, when you have gotten these people to get their act in order, then you make them accountable for how they're going to secure those databases of information that they have. This is two levels of addressing the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that since we are running out of time a little bit, that we should open up the discussion to both of you. Hello, Tor, welcome back. And so just on that last point, Ling, that you were talking about, the fact that like this product, problem spans a number of industries. It affects people at every level. Does this mean that we need to have stronger collaboration and communication between lawmakers and big tech?
Isn't that happening? Or at least on moves,
Right.
there are moves, and that's going to depend on where in the world you exist and which jurisdictions you're operating in. In my view, the EU and the GDPR is actually leading the charge on this, and people have said already, and the GDPR is actually the gold standard for how data protection should be approached. But the thing is here, I think what underscores the ethos, the spirit of the GDPR is a very European concept of privacy of the person. And in other states, in other countries, in other legal systems, that may not be something which is recognized explicitly as a fundamental human right, and I've written on this before and I think there was a question earlier on towards Tor from someone in the audience about, are we looking at the death of privacy? And I think, was it last year, I wrote a commentary entitled The Death of Privacy by 1,000 Data Cuts. And at one point I was honestly wondering to myself, is this what we have to give up for an existence of a digital and easy, seamless, the internet knows you and will provide for your every need without you having to ask for in terms of, is this the kind of existence you want? Is this what we have to give up? And do we want to do that? Because what do we then become? We have no more agency. And here's the thing. The data industry relies on us, on human beings as the source of the data. And I mentioned this in my presentation. Isn't it time we took back the power for ourselves? If we really want to stop it at the source, or we can control it. I mean, if you want to kind of use or stretch the oil analogy even further, the land upon which you extract crude, who owns it? It's controlled, isn't it? You have to have a right to actually harvest or extract that resource, which you then shunt down a whole value chain, like a whole downstream value chain of churning it out, and like a whole plethora of different kind of products. So maybe we borrow an analogy from that we look at the source and see how we can reinforce the protections around the source and the owners of that source, which is us.
Right. Tor, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think looking back at some of our research, we were extremely lucky to have this super cross-disciplinary team with myself and my colleague Andreas Claesson from the cybersecurity side, the Norwegian Consumer Council as consumer rights experts, and then digital consumer rights experts in particular. We had some independent privacy researchers, Wolfie Crystal and Zach Edwards, and we had the legal experts at Norway. And even with all this expertise, we ended up with 2 reports totaling 270, 280 pages. And that was because this whole topic is so extremely complex and so extremely hard to get into. But I think that still that kind of collaboration is really what we need in order to be able to communicate these issues to policymakers, and to the general public, because we need these concrete examples. We know on an abstract level, we know that the advertising companies are watching us, but we need to get kind of the plain facts on the table. How does this actually work in practice? Because then we can start discussing the policy issues, and then we can start asking ourselves the question, is this okay, or is this something we have to do something about?
Right, right. I do have another question from one of our viewers, David Dinger. And the question is, should the regulations focus on the data or industries, or both? What's the higher payoff? I think, Tor, maybe you should give this a shot first.
I would say it probably needs to follow the data, because I think it is quite hard to kind of draw a clear line between these different industries and between these different roles that companies play in the markets, and particularly as the market changes and evolves.
I think I have to agree with that. If you stop it at source, if you make it more difficult for data to be taken from people, and you impose more conditions on the taking of data from people, and you are more transparent about it, I think that's maybe one way to stop the problem at source. Often you will hear, and certainly in the case of Singapore, you will hear that, oh, but this is something that we need to be able to have our economy, we want to be a data hub and all that. Then it's even more so, do you have to ensure that this is the data of your citizens who are expecting you to discharge, your responsibility as regulators, to ensure that their trust in you is not broken, that you are looking out for them. So it is. I'm not saying this is easy. This is a very, very difficult balancing act, but it must be done. It must be done, and it's a continuous calibration. And I don't feel as though it's one, or it's data or the market. I think you start somewhere, and then you see where the chips fall, and you go from there. But I don't think there's any harm in actually laying everything, like Tor is saying, laying out the cards on the table, say, look, guys, this is where we are. Do we want to continue in this vein? Is this where we want to go? Are we all, heading down this road and not realizing, the impacts of, are we heading down with our eyes open but not seeing? I know it's a bit of a strange turn of phrase, but yeah, that's my add to that.
Responsibility that governments have to their citizens. I mean, it's almost like a new social contract in a way.
It is entirely a new social contract, Christina. You have nailed it. This is a new social contract, and in case anyone hasn't realized, and sometimes I feel it is being renegotiated unilaterally.
Right. I do have another question from Hamid, which is, what do you think about creating a market whereby data can be bought or collected from willing individuals, but not by individuals who do not want to sell their data. And that would there be serious penalties for collecting data by unwilling individuals?
I believe this idea has been posited by Jaron Lanier already. Sort of like a management of data, sort of like market, but that's leaving it to market forces. And this is reminiscent to me of the collective rights or collecting societies for like music rights or like image rights that you have in the media industry, where you have like different, you have ASCAP, you have BMI, you have different collecting societies, you've got IFP, and it's fragmented, it's messy, and you, the person who is the source of the data, had to decide, okay, today I am going to sell this in this market, or I let my rights. So it's a method, but in my mind, it's still onerous for the individual, and there may well not be any coherence in this. And it's your information. I'd like to see an experiment. I really would. Whether it actually works, maybe because I understand that the collective, that the existing models in the media industry not working, breaking down, becoming a bit more difficult.
Right. So I guess oh, sorry, Tor, please go on.
I think Tor wants to see. Tor has
I guess the first question that pops into my head here is kind of how could we envision this kind of market in terms of informed consent? So in a sense, how would it be possible to communicate to individuals in a transparent way what they are consenting to or not consenting to? And that's a problem we see quite regularly with GDPR as well. And with all these cookie pop-ups that you see everywhere, that they're asking for your consent to do something, but it's completely impossible for a regular person to understand what is this something and what are the implications of that. And so I think that getting to a higher level of transparency is really going to be a precondition.
Okay, great. So as sort of a concluding question or topic, really, I'd like to hear from either or both of you, sort of what do you think are the best ways forward? And you both come from sort of slightly different perspectives on this, but I'm happy to hear what either of you have to say. I know it's such
Tor has muted himself, so I should go first.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that kind of keeps you up at night. Is like wondering what should we do next if it was down to a few of us to figure out what to do next. Shine a light, educate people. Require the industry, and I mean industry, that the current players, there is a great resource online where you can see, I think I forget the name of the website now, but you can get all like the top line information on who the main players in the industry are. Bring them forward, challenge their existence, give them a chance to say to defend themselves, to say this, why what we do is actually important and valuable. It's funny because technology is supposed to, disintermediate, take out the middleman, and yet in this particular industry, it's springing up, middlemen are springing up like mushrooms, after a rain in a forest. And we have to look at maybe disintermediating the disintermediators away.
Right. And Tor?
I think kind of kind of a key here would be to be able to enforce more transparency. And because this industry is so distributed, it's also kind of a question of jurisdiction, who is actually able to regulate this industry. And I think some of the larger markets like the European Union, like the United States, have to go forward on some level and basically drive change. I guess it's really an open question whether today's behavioral advertising is kind of a business model that should exist in the future, at least without significantly more constraints, because yeah, today it really feels like it's out of control.
So we will fit in one last question that actually does relate to what both of you said from one of our viewers. So it's not just me being greedy and stealing your time. So from Simon Baca, what motivation can be great enough to make governments and regulatory bodies, both national and international, to force the private data broking industry, as disinformation and election interference do not seem to be enough?
That's a tough one.
No,
I do think that kind of attitudes are changing over time, and I think that the discussion has moved quite far from 2016 until today, and hopefully it will keep moving. I'm not sure if there's going to be kind of a single force or a single event that's going to drive it, but yeah, it's hard to say.
And the one thing that's popped into my head is insofar as it is possible, these institutions, do they want to ensure their continuation, their relevance in our societies? I mean, institutional trust is all-time low. With technology and social media, whether governments like it or not, or regulators or large corporate entities, people are noticing when things don't look good, and people are speaking out.
Right. So it really does seem just like a problem that will require so much time, really, time and effort to work on, and persistence as well, coming from multiple angles, from the tech angle, from the legal side, having to work its way through various national, regional governments. But yes, thank you both so much for joining me today to talk about this pressing issue that really affects every aspect of our lives. So I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day or evening in Ling's case, get some rest, or just be like me and get back to stressing about the election results like the rest of the world.
I'm going to try and sleep and wake up for that, but like I said, I'm still recovering from reading Thor's report, and I'm like, oh my God. Brain's just spinning.
Yes, anxiously awaiting. Well, thank you both so much.
You're welcome.
We really, really
Thank you very much
appreciate
for hosting us.
your time.
Yeah.
Thanks. And so this concludes our 4th installment of StratCom Talks. I would like to thank all of our viewers who took the time out today to join us in this discussion and for participating. You guys came up with some really, really riveting questions. We weren't able to even ask all of them because we were running out of time. So thank you. And next week, we will be discussing the Kremlin attempts to use history for foreign and national ends. And so tune in for that discussion, same time, same place. And thank you very much.